Hey, welcome back to the NOTCAST number 388. It is the 10th of June 2024. I normally do one of these twice a week. I've been doing about one a week recently because I do them when I'm in the mood and I'm enthusiastic. And like anything, as soon as it becomes an obligation, it starts to become work. And I don't earn enough money from this to make it worthwhile doing. I don't make any money from this. I think I've had one pint bought for me in the whole time, which works out about an hour every two. For every hour I've done, I've earned about 2p, which is terrible, really, when you think about it. Far below minimum wage. Since today is the 10th of June, and last time I talked about a record from 30 years ago, Morrissey's Vauxhall and I. Today I'm going to be talking a record from a mere 41 years ago. And I'm going to have to start by telling you a story about something that didn't happen to me. Yes, it happened to a friend, genuinely a friend, who was listening to this. He's someone born from in Birmingham. It's about the year 2000. He's listening to an album and his girlfriend goes, "What is this Meatloaf shit?" Well, this Meatloaf shit is Pink Floyd's 12th studio record, The Final Cut, also referred to by Roger Waters as an abject misery to make, but also described by David Gilmour as the final straw. This is the last time that Roger Waters, David Gilmour and Nick Mason all worked together in a recording studio. And in fact, since the release of this, the classic lineup of Pink Floyd, including Rick Wright, played live one time 22 years after this was released. So it's fair to say it was a difficult birth. And I'm also going to be talking about some of the other stuff that came out from that period. The Great Collection of Dance Songs album, Not Now John, the When the Tigers Broke Free single, all manner of goody two-shoe stuff that's really actually quite miserable. This is not a fun record to listen to. It wasn't a fun record to make. Even now, it feels more like something that should be hung in a gallery as a work of sonic art as opposed to an album to be listened to for enjoyment in your leisure time. It is not fun. And we start off the period because there's a significant kind of overlap between this album and The Wall, with what's happening around about the Wall period. The first thing which came out, and actually one of the most important recordings in the Pink Floyd catalogue, and you may not necessarily think this, is this 1981 compilation album, A Great Collection of Dance Songs, titled so because you just can't dance to Pink Floyd. And this features, effectively, it's a single disc kind of mini greatest hits album that's designed to tell some kind of story about the band. It features an alternate mix of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and it also features a previously unreleased version of Another Brick in the Wall, effectively a 12-inch remix of the track. Is it good? Not necessarily. What it does do, though, and it does have a very, very important song in Pink Floyd's chronology. It is Money from Dark Side of the Moon, is on A Great Collection of Dance Songs. And the reason that this song is so important is because they couldn't license the original recording of Money for the compilation from CBS Records. CBS said, no, it's one of the big sellers on Dark Side of the Moon, you can't have it. Which meant that when A Great Collection of Dance Songs was released on the 23rd of November 1981, David Gilmour went into the studio on his own with Dick Parry, the band's saxophonist, and re-recorded Money entirely with no other members of the band present, which means that there isn't actually a single member of Pink Floyd that plays on any single Pink Floyd song, which is not in itself necessarily a surprise. Well, you can think between, 1968 when David Gilmour joined the group, at least somebody had played on everything. But you listen to this, it tells you it's Pink Floyd and it's one guy working on his own, which is an unusual kind of position to be. But also I think it gave David Gilmour the confidence to know that he could step free from working with other musicians under the Pink Floyd banner if that's what he really wanted. I don't know why Roger wasn't involved, or Nick, or Rick. Well, I know why Rick wasn't involved, because he wasn't in the band anymore. He left the band at the end of the Wall shows in 1981. But this, I think, proved to David that if he really wanted to create a reasonable facsimile of the Pink Floyd sound, he could do it on his own without anybody else necessarily doing it. Then after that, it's then just a short step to writing your own songs. And that is another episode. Money did get a release as a single. Here is the Dutch 12-inch. This is, put bluntly, pretty beaten up. but it is, after all, 40-something years old. And it features the album version of Money here on the A side of the 12-inch, and on the B side, for some reason, the album version of Any Colour You Like, which is licensed from the album, presumably because CBS had the rights to Money in the US and wouldn't release it. The band therefore felt that if they were going to do a single in Europe, they could license it back to themselves. So actually, the re-recording of Money, which here is the only commercial 12-inch release of Money that I can recall, is not actually the version of the album, but the re-recording designed to thwart those evil greed heads, to quote Julian Cope from CBS Records in 1981. It's an interesting album. It's not in any way essential. When it comes to filling in your Pink Floyd discography, this is probably the last one which you need to chase down. You certainly don't need to get it first at all. It has a really good cover, by the way. This cover is shot at Dungeness in Kent, which is not too far away from one of my favourite places in the world. And Dungeness is, I think it's the only place in Britain that has desert conditions, which is pretty strange when you think about it like that. And the concept of it is that it's two dancers, but they're held in place by guide ropes. So it's dancers who can't move. It's a joke title, in the same way that you can't dance to Pink Floyd. I've tried, you can't do it. No matter what kind of dance remix of On an Island they use on the Royal Albert Hall DVD. But that's an important part of the band's story, because it effectively tells you, starting from the off, that David Gilmour was starting to repair his confidence and knows, I can do this on my own if I've absolutely got to. 1981, as I've mentioned previously, did feature the Wall shows. This is a programme from the London Earls Court show in 1981. I bought this for £7 a few years ago, just sitting in a box somewhere, sitting in a cardboard box in a record shop. Not a show that I went to, although Guy Pratt, who plays bass with a number of bands related to Pink Floyd, including Pink Floyd, saw many of the shows here. This features all the lyrics to the Wall album, concept art and photos, and I think this one was sold at Earls Court in London in 1981. It features, somewhat oddly and more democratically than you might expect, the band members to be listed by their alphabetical surnames as opposed to anything else. So the first name that you see on there is Andy Bowen, and then David Gilmour, Nick Mason, Andy Roberts, Roger Waters, Willie Wilson, Pete Woods and Richard Wright. The idea of actually saying it's performed by Pink Floyd is not on there at all. It tells you there are actually 8 people that are performing Pink Floyd's The Wall. The concept of Pink Floyd has become pretty nebulous at this point. So, for example, if they had been clear that Rick Wright had left the group, it would have said Pink Floyd with the 3 names on and then Rick Wright at the bottom. But no, handy bit of typography hides it for you. Those shows at the Earls Court were filmed for live inserts to be used in 1982's motionless picture, or emotionless picture, The Wall, which is still not on Blu-ray. This is a DVD version of it, and The Wall is a thoroughly depressing watch. I do not recommend it to anybody. It features material it quotes from Money, for example. It quotes from a track that appears on Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, the Roger Waters solo album. It features some lines from The Final Cut, I think, and also features a song that wasn't released on any Pink Floyd album officially for a very long time, and the single that accompanied the album, When the Tigers Broke Free. When the Tigers Broke Free is an important song in Pink Floyd's mythology. And not only did The Wall feature new versions of songs, it featured new recordings and previously unreleased versions of Empty Spaces, What Do We Do Now, Young Lust, Mother, In the Flesh, Bring the Boys Back Home, and a multitude of other songs. When the Tigers Broke Free was the first post-Wall song that was included. And as I previously kind of alluded to, it says on the back, When the Tigers Broke Free, backed with Bring the Boys Back Home. It's taken from the album The Final Cut. It didn't appear on The Final Cut until the CD issue in 2004 of the album, which means the only place you could get When the Tigers Broke Free for many years was on this 7-inch single. And when you listen to the 7-inch single and you kind of go, I can't think of anything less deserving of hit single status, it is a miserable trawl. In the film, it's split into two parts, and there's a different mix and there's a different vocal than there is to the single. Look at that. That's happy, cheerful Bob Geldof there having a nervous breakdown in front of your very eyes. But also the mix that's on the single is still not on a Pink Floyd album, by the way, as far as I can remember. Its first CD release was in 1990 when it appeared on this Roger Waters' The Wall Berlin 1990 sampler, and that features a different mix to the version that is included on Echoes. So the Echoes, the 2001 compilation from the Pink Floyds, features a different mix, different vocal mix and different percussion to the version that's on here. I don't have the 2004 CD of the final cut because I have no need for it, and that's not the configuration of the album that I think is best. So I don't know if it's this mix or that mix. I don't care either. The differences between the two mixes are so infinitesimally small, it makes no difference whatsoever. And whilst the Wall, or more correctly the final cut, was originally intended to be kind of a soundtrack album to go alongside the Wall film, the Wall film soundtrack itself was never released, although there is a bootleg CD here, which means that there is that lost, missing Pink Floyd track in the band's body of work. Released then on the 21st of March 1983, the final cut, or the final straw, depending on your point of view and if your name's David Gilmour. I like this album, and I don't like this album at all. It's spectacularly unfriendly. It's almost hostile to the listener. There's no soft edges in it. There's no musical enjoyment in it. It feels like having your finger, or more correctly, having someone very angry point their finger in your face for about 43 minutes about how war is bad. Pretty much, if you wanted to write an album that would be the soundtrack to an Oliver Stone war movie, the final cut would be it. The idea started from unused material from the Wall album. Roger was prolifically writing new material, so some of the songs which were written for the Wall, which weren't included, I think include, and let me just quickly check, Paranoid Eyes, The Gunner's Dream, The Hero's Return, and a number of other ones as well. Possibly the final cut itself. I think Your Possible Pasts might have been a track as well that was written for the Wall but taken off the running order and instead repurposed. So whereas the Wall is this huge, epic, double album tale of a rock star who lost his dad in the Second World War, building an emotional wall around himself so as not to communicate with anyone, the final cut picks up one of those strands and turns it into a whole album. So this is effectively the Rogue One, or perhaps the Batwoman of Pink Floyd's body of work. Something which nobody necessarily expected or necessarily wanted, but you got it anyway, whether you liked it or not. And the final cut is an album that looks at two things. Effectively, first of all, it's an anti-war concept album, heavily inspired by current events in 1982, the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands, and the idea that somehow people that had seen the Second World War in the 40s were exasperated and confused that Britain was still going to war in the 1980s. And what they didn't know yet is we still had the Gulf War and Afghanistan, and we had all of those other conflicts to go through yet. And somewhere in the world right now, at any given time, there is a war that's happening. I think there's been about 6 days in the history of mankind since about 1847 or something, where there hasn't actually been a war declared at some point between two countries at a bare minimum. The world is quite literally at war. And war is the failure of diplomacy, but it's not just the failure of diplomacy. It doesn't imply a failure of diplomats. It implies a failure of communication and a breakdown of relationships between two, not necessarily opposing parties, but two parties that fundamentally don't understand each other, which means that the final cut is a great metaphor for what was happening in the band at the time. Rick said the band had lost any feeling of connection and camaraderie. It was a band that was falling to pieces. The album itself was made out of reused material that was rejects from the Wall, alongside some other pieces that had been written by Roger, with the idea to create a new piece which linked together the discarded parts, almost kind of like, what's the word I'm thinking of here? Kind of like, you know, when you look at yesterday's leftovers and you have to make a meal and it ends up being, you know, a chicken tikka bolognese or something, and you kind of look at it and go, we're not quite sure that all fits together. It was planned originally to be called Spare Bricks, but that idea was reviewed. The Falklands put the war at the front of Roger Waters' mind, and he then kind of took the idea of, and this is where I have to look at my piece of paper here over here, is it was a protest against swinging back to the right wing after the promise of the post-war dream, which of course is the first track on the album, the launch of the NHS, the war to end all wars, the end of rationing, the liberalism, and the idea of then us, mankind, as a civilization, as a race, or as a species, kind of swinging back to a Dickensian us and them approach, where people were fighting against each other for basic things as opposed to working together for a common goal. And David, it's fair to say, was not a fan of that. He disliked obviously political songs, though there is of course Dogs of War on the Momentary Lapse of Reason album, and prefers to let his art be less direct and less obvious, which actually I'm more sympathetic to than anybody else. One of the comments under my Sisters of Mercy article was going, well, I could have skipped the first 17 minutes for the economics lesson. And I think it's really important to understand the historical context that sits around the release of any art. Art is not created in a vacuum. It's not created outside of all other things. Even something like the X-Men movies, for example, which you might look at and go, yeah, they're built against the concept of repression of otherness and the idea of looking for a cure for gayness or difference, and the whole kind of plot strands that stand up in X2 and X-Men The Last Stand. And when you start to think of it about that, you think everything is a metaphor. Now, sometimes you might be looking a bit too much. I think that, let's say, Overkill by Motorhead doesn't have a secondary layer to its lyrics, although bloody hell, what a great song that is. All these songs have a secondary layer that sit next to them. So the idea of going, is mankind really so stupid as to repeat the mistakes of the past? And those who do not understand the mistakes of their past are doomed to repeat them. First time as tragedy, second time as fast, to quote Frank Turner. So if you've got your band bingo going on, I've just mentioned Frank Turner, tick that one off. I'm a great fan of him as well. The unused material from The Wall and the new songs kind of didn't really feel like it was a great classic Pink Floyd record. David felt that many of the tracks were not worthy of inclusion. Waters accused him of not contributing. And the continuation of the recordings that happened for the Wall, the film, such as, the inclusion of Tigers on some editions of the final cut, the lyric from Money, and from Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, all kind of melded together and going, well, I've got enough songs to make an album. David said, and I think these songs aren't good enough then, why are they good enough now? And Roger considered releasing it as a solo LP with David and Nick as performers, but not releasing it under the Pink Floyd name. Although Pink Floyd did owe their label an album. It was an album that every member of Pink Floyd played on. It was a Roger Waters album in all but name, which happened to have the members of Pink Floyd performing on it. I think there's only one vocal by David Gilmour on the album. Reminds me, actually, and this is a weird one, of Mask by The Mission, which was originally recorded, or started off recording as a Wayne Hussey solo record, and then became a Mission album halfway through, where the other members of The Mission worked out that they were playing on it. EMI would not cooperate. They said, you can't release this as a solo album. And Roger realised early on that he would never work with David or Nick in the recording studio ever again. Apparently David only wrote 3 songs in 5 years. But from one point of view, Roger Waters imposed a deadline to achieve his vision, wasn't really open to other people contributing, and said to Nick, whatever you do is just drumming. So there was no extra credit there. It felt very much that Roger regarded himself as, I am Pink Floyd, and the rest of you are lucky to have me. How true that is, I don't know. But the fact that David released his solo album in 1984 called About Face kind of indicates that he did have some songs that he wasn't given the opportunity to really flex. And the story is perhaps least authentically told in this amazing thing, Pink Floyd Experience. This is a compendium of 6 issues of a graphic novel by the band, or more correctly, not by the band, by somebody else, on Rock and Roll Comics. That was published in about 2011. And this features such wonderful moments as when the band are recording the final cut and things go a little bit weird and a little bit odd. So let's just quickly pick out a sample one from here, and I'm going to have to go across the pages here and get to the point where they're talking about making the final cut. And for example, this bit here sounds like another fucking autobiography. It's weak, we need to take a month off and develop some new ideas. To which Roger, poorly drawn, says, no, we're recording this. And then there's arguments, lots of arguments. Of course, the album is narrated by a schoolteacher who survived World War II. At night, his defences slips and he relives the horrors of the war. To which, of course, we have the moments where the band effectively splits up. I don't know if you can read that. David says it's just not working. To which Roger, and I suspect this isn't actually true, I suspect some dramatic license has taken place here, is, fuck you, you never liked the songs to begin with. To which he says, you're right. But it's supposed to be a group effort and it could be a great album. To which Roger goes, who do you think you are? Really overstating the comic book element of it. And then David says, as a co-producer, it's my job to cut out the meandering crap between the real songs. And Roger is, either you relinquish your role as co-producer or I scrap the whole thing. At which point he goes, call me if you need a guitar player. David's production credit is not listed on the album credits on the back, but he does get the royalty for it. And I think he had a role in the album, even if you wouldn't necessarily think that would have been the role on the record. So the making of this, as he quite rightly said, the final straw indeed. And it's a difficult record. It's a backstory that nobody needs to be told. And it's been horrendously dated by the Falklands. And as I mentioned in a previous episode when I was talking about politics, no art is made in isolation. But when you start to name individual politicians, things become very, very dated. It becomes almost like a snake eating itself. And the lyrics on here, which mention Galtieri, Brezhnev, Thatcher, Begin, Reagan, for example, a home for incurable tyrants and wasters of life and limb. And you kind of sit there and go, Thatcher, dead. Reagan, dead. Brezhnev, probably dead. Not quite sure. Galtieri, almost definitely dead. And then you kind of go, it's just a list of dead people, isn't it? And of course, that cliche that tradition is just rules made by dead people. And that's where you get to the point where the album has lost some of its timelessness because it draws back very, very closely to the 1982 Falklands War. And one of my first memories of the Falklands War was the famous kind of Sun headline that had a shot of the General Belgrano, the Argentinian battleship. And it just says, gotcha! On it. And it's like, really? We've reduced it to no more than you sunk my battleship? Is that the world we live in? And even as someone who was, 9, I was like, this is ridiculous. This is childish. And war is serious. And you can't just sit around and go, gotcha. We killed 200 of you guys. And it's like, really? That is the level that we're dealing at? The infantilization and stupidization of mass media, culture, communication and news. But that, of course, is the Amused to Death album by the Roger of Waters, which I will get to in due course when I can be bothered to get around to it. The album is 12 pretty grueling songs, it's fair to say, and opens with The Post-War Dream. This is a requiem for the post-war dream by Roger Waters. The post-war dream being that the future would be better than the past, and being dragged back to war by people that want to win elections. And make no mistake about it, if the Falklands had not happened just before an election year, I'm not sure that the results and the decisions would have been exactly the same. was effectively a gift to the Conservative Party in 1983 to say, yeah, we went to war. Michael Foot would have just handed it over to them. You've got to trust us with Britain, the waving the flag of patriotism whilst at the same point selling the country down the river. Yeah, I ain't voting Conservative in the upcoming election. And we'll find out what happens there, won't we, boys and girls? The post-war dream is, I think, a strange lyric. So there's three key kind of images that are on the front. Firstly, there's the field of poppy, the poppy fields. So the poppy fields of, I think, I can't remember where it is now. Ypres, I think, in France, where people planted poppies and wore them on the 11th of November to symbolise the fact that they will never forget the war to end all wars that didn't actually end all wars. In the fields of green, a corner of a foreign field that is forever England, which quotes from the Rupert Brooke's poem The Soldier, I believe. This one here, which is a picture of the Japanese flag and some welding, which of course, if it wasn't for the Nips being so good at building ships, we'd still be building them on the River Tyne, which is, I think, a lyric from the start of the album. That use of the derogatory phrase is used by Roger Waters, who isn't exactly always ambiguous in his lyrics, and perhaps he should be. And then the last one here, the 12th song, the final image of the triptych here, is the nuclear explosion, the summation of the ultimate conclusion of conflict that would happen between human beings, where and personally I think maybe we should have leaders of our countries get onto horses and fight battles in fields with stakes, go jousting and fight to the death, rather than sending hundreds of British people off to die in a country die in a place they can't pronounce. And that's partially what I think one of some of the problems are, because if you actually got the leaders to go and fight the wars, there'd be a heck of a lot less wars, wouldn't there? Or, as I think one philosopher said, that actually the codes to the nuclear detonations shouldn't be carried in what they call the football, which is carried by somebody that walks around with the president, but should actually be buried inside a package inside somebody's heart. So if you're going to actually want to have to go and detonate nuclear weapons, you have to cut a living human being open, kill them and say this is the only way. And then that makes you, as a president, face the reality of what you're going to do when you launch a nuclear code. Is you're going to be murdering millions and possibly billions of people and changing life forever on this planet. And the scientists think we may in fact be all alone out there in the universe, which, depending on who you talk to, is either the most terrifying or the least terrifying thing out there. Both of which are terrifying concepts. Is the idea that yes, we are the only sentient life forms that have invented air and electricity and air guitar and everything, or we're not alone and there's aliens out there and they're deliberately avoiding us because they think mankind is a bunch of idiots. Both are very, very probable outcomes. Although, of course, only one can be probable, because no two things can be equally probable, and there's only 100% of chances in an either-or situation. So the lyric on the post-war dream is, if it wasn't for the Nips being so good at building ships, the yards would still be open on the Clyde. Oh, Maggie, what have we done? What have we done to England? So this is the opening song is, the Japanese being a former enemy that were defeated in the Second World War, actually taking over things like manufacturing defence and ships for the British Navy. Now, how true that is, I don't know. I'm not an expert on the naval supply and construction capability in 1983. Yes, there is something I'm not an expert on. But it's a curious concept, one that runs through the rest of the film and the rest of the album, like a kind of like a stick of rock, really. There's Your Possible Pasts, and Your Possible Pasts, one of the songs that was rejected from the wall, or not used for the wall in its final go. The idea of going, do you remember me, how we used to be? Do you think we should be closer? The idea of a ghost or a separation between two people who are together but apart at the same point, trying to make it work. The man who'd been to war, haunted by the things that he saw. And, my granddad fought in the First World War, lied about his age, like the cliche in the poems is, never talked about it. I wish I'd had an opportunity to talk with him about it, but I was like 14 and interested in Star Wars at the time, and he was interested in not talking about actual wars. So I completely understand that. And Your Possible Pasts is used in between Waiting for the Worms and Stop in the film of the wall, the idea of a distance between people. And then we have the third track is One of the Few, and this One of the Few is a good song, but they're all dirges, they're all slow, they're all mogodon. Rick has left, so Michael Kamen, the orchestrator who I saw play live with David Gilmour in 2001, who played with Pink Floyd in 1990, who orchestrated Metallica's S&M concerts as well, and a lot of movie scores, including Brazil, and I think Lethal Weapon, come to think of it. Effectively replaced Rick Wright's delicate keyboard touch with an orchestration that was sympathetic, but it just didn't sound like Pink Floyd. It sounded like someone that was almost Pink Floyd, it sounded like 3/4 of Pink Floyd, but it didn't actually sound like Pink Floyd. Most of the album, by the way, suffers from a lack of that touch. So I think the drums really only come in possibly Your Possible Pasts, I think. And then there's some of the songs don't have any drumming on whatsoever. One of the Few, I think, is one of them. And there's hardly any drumming on the record at all. David doesn't play much in terms of lead guitar. I think there's a solo on Fletcher Memorial Home, Final Cut, Not Now John. But those are all on, side 2 of the record. There might be one on The Gunner's Dream, but there is only 3 or 4 solos. He only gets one set of vocals on it, which is Not Now John. It really feels like Roger Waters is calling all of the shots and the other guys are standing around waiting for Roger to go, okay, you can play 4 bars now, go, stop, shut up, stop, do as you're told, that kind of thing. So it really doesn't feel like a band album at all. It feels like a solo album when you listen to it. And I think you can tell the difference between solo albums and band albums. Solo albums have a very insular, one-dimensional feel to them. You can tell they're the product largely of just one mind. Band albums, you can feel that there's multiple facets to the personalities kind of all trying to make their way out of it. The best solo albums are the one where it doesn't sound like it's just one guy in a room with a laptop making a load of noise. And by that, what I mean is you can listen to, for example, Pretty Hate Machine by Nine Inch Nails, the Foo Fighters debut, and you don't get an impression that isn't the work of more than one personality. So there's a rounded sense of it. Possibly that's because, well, frankly, Trent could play pretty much any instrument under the universe: saxophone, guitar, bass, drums, vocals, keyboards, probably clarinet and theremin, actually, for Nine Inch Nails. Or Foo Fighters, for example, Dave Grohl, drums, bass, guitar, sing. There's nothing the guy can't do apart from possibly make an absolutely amazing lasagna. Oh, hang on, I saw the video where he said he got an amazing lasagna, so maybe you could do that as well. Is there no end to the man's talents? Who knows? There's a difference between a band album and a solo album. Now, if you have the 1984 version, the next track 4, is The Hero's Return. If you have the 2004 CD, When the Tigers Broke Free is the next song, and it is an appalling place to put When the Tigers Broke Free. It doesn't fit lyrically, it doesn't fit musically, it's in the wrong place on the album. It really, really, really is. It should be on side 2. When the Tigers Broke Free should be track 3, side 2, in between the Fletcher Memorial Home and Southampton Dock. And the reason being is that the last lyric of When the Tigers Broke Free is Roger talking about it was one day up the Anzio Bridgehead in 1944 where High Command took my daddy away from me. And then the opening lines of Southampton Dock are, they stood on Southampton Dock and there were too many spaces in the line, clearly indicating, by the way, that there was people had not come back from the war. They disembarked in 45 and no one spoke and no one smiled. There were too many spaces in the line. Is Southampton Dock. So if you're going to listen to this album and change the track order around, I'd suggest putting When the Tigers Broke Free just before Southampton Dock. And what I'd also suggest is, instead of having track 4 as The Hero's Return, you have track 4 as Not Now John on side 1, because that's where it works. And also the album is too bloody slow and it really needs a kick up the arse by the time you get to the 4th song. It just doesn't work. So for example, the last lyric of One of the Few, make them laugh, make them cry, make them lie down and die. And then, of course, Not Now John just simply kind of can barge in there at that point with fuck all that. We've got to get on with this. We've got to compete with the wily Japanese. There's too many home fires burning and not enough trees. And it's a fast, pacey song. It's the nearest thing to a single that you'll get on the record, Not Now John. I really, really like it, actually. I think it's a solid song. But it's about society sleepwalking sleepwalking into an awful end. It's about society kind of going, well, who cares if the planet burns? We've got to do this in order to make profit. Lovely, lovely, lovely profit, etc. The single of Not Now John, the only single actually released from the Wall, came on a 7-inch with this sensitive cover photo here, and this 12-inch here as well. And it features two unusual tracks. The 7-inch features a single version, and the single version replaces the word fuck with people shouting stuff. So stuff all that, we've got to get on with this. But more importantly, the B-side features The Hero's Return parts 1 and 2. Only part 1 of The Hero's Return is on the album. Part 2 is an extra verse and a reprise of the track featuring a different vocal, and I suspect, by the sounds of it, an early mix of the track there. So part 2 is one of the rarest Pink Floyd songs that's been commercially released, I think it's fair to say, and it features effectively a reprise of The Hero's Return. So to really experience the final cut in its full glory, you do need this 7-inch single or this 12-inch single to use The Hero's Return parts 1 and 2. And The Hero's Return is, I think it's a really good track, but I think it's dealing with the knowledge of what you saw when you were at war. So when you come back from the war, and effectively it goes, Jesus, what's it all about? Trying to clout these little ingrates into shape. There was no time to whine and mope about. The idea of being, well, you've been in a war. And when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the 7 things that you've got, which are on there at the bottom, it's like food, water, oxygen, survival. And that's the kind of thing that perhaps when you sit around and go, there is no time to whine and mope about if you're in a war zone. You have to get food, get sleep, and get the girl and kill the baddies and save the entire planet, to quote popularly to yourself, which is not something you necessarily get an opportunity to do. But when you're at school and you've got time and you're more civilized, you're then able to ask questions like, well, who am I? What's this all about? And why do I have to do what you tell me? And then you end up kind of going, Jesus, kids these days, they're all snowflakes, aren't they? They're terrible. We should need a damn good war. Reintroduce national service. Not a good idea, guys. Not a good idea. And The Hero's Return is about that idea of being demobbed and wearing a thing called zoot suits, which you go back into society as a member of society, and you then try to work out, well, what's actually going on here? What is society? Is this what I fought, died and fought for to try and maintain and keep it? And is it really worth, fighting for? Is this the life we really want? And going through that concept, that idea of going, I fought for this, and now they kind of, to quote the great Sylvester Stallone in First Blood, the only Rambo film worth watching, is that they call me baby killer, etc., etc., and they weren't there and they don't know what it's all about, man. So when we come back from the war, the banners and flags hung on everyone's door. We danced and we sang in the street and the church bells rang. But burning in my heart, my memories shoulders on of the gunners' dying words on the intercom. And then we have the gunner's dream. So all of the lyrics are meant to design to fit together and work with one another. Putting When the Tigers Broke Free before The Hero's Return is just not the right place to have it at all. The gunner's dream, again, not a Wall outtake. The Hero's Return is. The gunner's dream was around that post-war dream of a world free of terrorism, better than tomorrow. There's a lyric about blowing up bandsmen by remote control, which makes a direct reference to the 1982 Hyde Park bombing in London, where there was a terrorist event where bombs were placed and blew up a military parade, for example. Terrible, terrible situation, of course. And then there's that the other lyric around you never hear their standard issue kicking in your doors, and you never know, and what's more, no one ever disappears. And you can relax on both sides of the tracks, and maniacs don't blow holes in bandsmen by remote control, and no one kills the children anymore. Yeah, happy lyrics. But someone who's clearly been traumatized by not only by war and what war did to him. After all, war did take his daddy away from him, and as not to sound flippant about it, that can actually be really traumatic, growing up without a father figure, or growing up without a present father figure. There's also that really haunting image in Pink Floyd, the film, the Wall, of the child kind of going up and taking a man's hands at the playground and then being brushed off, hoping that he could become or would have a dad, and finding out that he didn't, and that he was only, the product of a single parent household, because dad died before he was either born or before he was like 3 months old or something. It's a theme which Roger returned to many, many times, including The Wall, where she toured between 2010 and 2013. This is a Wall Tour t-shirt from Wembley Stadium in 2013, and is also a key factor in the Wall 2015 film which he released, which was a depiction of the live show from that period, alongside some documentary footage of Roger visiting the graves of his dead dad. The next track is Paranoid Eyes, and Paranoid Eyes kind of picks up from The Wall, and it's written from the point of view of the teacher who says you can't have any pudding if you don't eat your meat, and thrashed to death by his psychopathic wives to within an inch of his lives. The Paranoid Eyes is around just carrying on back in society, being repressed, not showing emotions, not participating in society, but just stiff upper lip and going for it. Let's go to side 2, shall we? Another cheery one. This is going to end up longer than the album, isn't it? Most of my NOTCASTs actually do. Is we have Get Your Filthy Hands Off My Desert, the shortest Pink Floyd song, apart from Round and Around, which technically speaking isn't really a Pink Floyd song because it's only 30 seconds long, and it's really only the fade to yet another movie. Get Your Filthy Hands Off My Desert is a strange song, which is only, 6 lines. Brezhnev took Afghanistan, Begin took Beirut, Galtieri took the Union Jack, and Maggie, over lunch one day, took a cruiser with all hands, apparently to make him give it back. Well, there's not much else you can say about that, really. It's then followed by the Fletcher Memorial Home, and that takes its name from Roger Waters' father, who I think was Eric Fletcher Waters. I could be wrong there. I'm an enthusiast, not an expert, not a historian. And that has the line about take all your overgrown infants away and build them a home with a place of their own, and the Fletcher Memorial Home for incurable tyrants and kings. The idea of rampant egos, of people that there are some people for whom power is the only end. Even having all the power in the world is not enough. They have to have all the power forever, all the money forever, play a zero-sum game where it is not enough for them to win. Others must lose. Other people must be thrown out of helicopters or taken away in the middle of the night by squads. Or apparently, if you defect from North Korea to South Korea, your family in North Korea is punished. This type of thing that rules with an iron fist, to quote The Great Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses. And there's that lyric which is all around just going, why don't we just take all of these weird, fucked up, power mad dictators and stick them in a home and make them live out their dreams, and then they can just leave the rest of us just get on and solve all the problems in the world without having to worry about their rampant, crazy egotism. Really good idea. Never going to work because like communism, great idea, not practical, but could really, really work in real life. So we have Southampton Dock next, the follow-on from that, and this is where When the Tigers Break Free should go into the album sequence. The Fletcher Memorial Home going on about how all these leaders are terrible and do awful things and force people to die, and how the leaders should go to war themselves. Follow it up with When the Tigers Break Free, where high command kind of took my daddy away from me in Anzio in one summer's day in bleak 1944, etc. And then follow it up with Southampton Dock. Southampton Dock being where the boats came back. So I remember watching on the news in 1982 as a 8 or 9 year old, the news coverage of the Ark Royal and all these battleships going off to Falklands, knowing that they'd arrive in 3 weeks' time, being waved off from Southampton Dock and knowing that not everybody would come back, as that some of them were going to die. And the last thing that some people see, some people at the ages of 17, 18, 19 of Britain, is that it just gets smaller and smaller in the distance, and finally it disappears. And then there's 3 weeks of boredom, and then there's about 2 weeks of fighting. And if you're lucky, you get to live. And if you're unlucky, you don't. And if you're even unluckier, you get to live covered in multiple burns and paralysed for the rest of your life. And the frustration that sits inside the arm going, really? We're doing this again? Can't we get Margaret Thatcher on a horse, General Galtieri, stick the two together and get them to fight it out whilst we eat bread in a circus? And there's a line in Southampton Dock, and still the dark stain spreads between his shoulder blades, a mute reminder of the poppy fields and graves. And when the fight was over, we spent what they had made, but in the bottom of our hearts, we made the final cut. Now, talking about, the stain spreading between the finger blades, there is this very, very important image on the back of the LP. I don't know if you can see this adequately. This is a general, and he is holding a film canister, and he has a knife in his back. And I'm just going to check, it's possibly more visible on the CD cover here, so I'm going to use that. This is a metaphor for the way in which Roger Waters felt that his ambitions for the wall motion picture had been treated, somehow conflating his artistic intentions for the album and the film alongside the way that Alan Parker betrayed him. There's a line in the final cut. The final cut is the person who has the final cut that signs off the finished version of a motion picture. And I think Roger felt betrayed that he hadn't had the final cut on the film, which meant that whatever he'd thrown all that money at, all that time, all that effort, that story he was trying to tell had been betrayed by the fact that he hadn't got the final cut, and so he wasn't able to fully tell the story in the way in which he wanted, which is why this soldier and veteran has a film canister under his arm, under his shoulder, and has that stain spreading between the shoulder blades as he has been stabbed in the back. But the metaphor is also working on the soldiers themselves being stabbed in the back by the government as well as Roger Waters. The man has no shortage of ego, of course, and just tell the Muffins they'll never fucking do it. So there is the Southampton Dock track. Then we have Final Cut, which is the title track from the album, of course. And it's about dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and a suicide attempt at the result of it. Some talk about suicidal ideation here. Pretty sure some of you watching this have had experienced feelings where you kind of thought, would I be better if I wasn't here? What would my life be like if I didn't have one? Would it be a better place to be than anywhere else? Really, really difficult set of concepts and ideas to talk through. One which has occurred to me on occasion. I too never had the nerve to make the final cut, of course, on the grounds that I'm still here. And the final cut is also talking about and using that concept about the idea of being betrayed. Now, I seem to remember, and this is quite embarrassing actually, when I was 17, I had to write about poetry. And I chose to write about, amongst other things, the lyrics of Pink Floyd and the Sisters of Mercy. I don't know where that handwritten essay is. I'm probably very glad, because I'd be mortified if I read it now. But the final cut was one of the ones that I chose from the Pink Floyd lyric book that was available to me at the time. And I didn't really understand what the lyric was. I understood what the lyric meant to me as a 17-year-old. I didn't understand what the lyric meant to Roger Waters. It'd probably be very embarrassing now. But that said, I was the most authentic me I could have been at that point in time, and I'm not embarrassed by who I was, apart from possibly liking a couple of really bad bands far too much. And some of those haircuts. Yeah, I had hair. I know you don't believe me. Then we have Not Now John, which I've talked about previously. It's track 11, the penultimate track on the album. So up to this point, you've spent 40 minutes, you haven't heard a shred of David Gilmour's voice. You've barely heard him play guitar. He's played about 3 solos on the whole album. Not Now John, he sings almost everything. and then it has a guitar solo, and then it fades out, and suddenly we're in the last track of the album, Two Suns in the Sunset. Two Suns in the Sunset is a really, really important Pink Floyd track, as important as Money, because it's the only album, or more correctly, the last track on the last album made by Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and David Gilmour, and Nick does not play drums on Two Suns in the Sunset. Drums are played by Andy Newmark, because apparently the drum patterns are too complicated. Now, I've played Two Suns in the Sunset. It's an offbeat. You really have to think an awful lot about how you're going to play it. You listen to it. If you're not listening to the drums, sounds okay. But if you try to play it, you're like, oh, I really need to think about where these going to land, because it doesn't work in a conventional time signature at all. And it misses beats, and it uses beats as punctuation. I would never play Two Suns in the Sunset the way that it is on this album, but then I'm not an amazing drummer. I'm an okay drummer, better than Lol, worse than Jason. And it's a difficult drum pattern to hit, but also it's a powerful song, and it's one of my favourite Pink Floyd songs, on the grounds that suddenly, you know, mankind, as mentioned previously, especially in things like the final cut, the title track, has lost patience with putting up with everything and has just decided, fuck it, we're going to go and do this. War, of course, being the failure of diplomacy. And as I've said before, some guy goes, get me the football, they get the codes out, they press the buttons, the nuclear bombs fly. And we were all living in a very heavy, imminent destruction kind of situation in 1983, 1984. You look at popular culture and you thought about things like Threads, Two Tribes, War Games. I think, what is it? There's a 1984 American TV show. Is it The Day After? I think, which kind of posits out what a post-nuclear America might look like, which apparently Ronald Reagan watched and made him change his mind about the validity of nuclear weapons and to consider whether we could go for a peace treaty instead. Two Suns in the Sunset is a really powerful song that tells the story of what would happen at the end of civilization if the bombs were triggered. They've set the doomsday clock to something like 90 seconds from midnight, not even 2 minutes to midnight, 90 seconds from midnight. The closest the world has been to World War III in decades. It's something which is on my mind now. I still think about the use of nuclear weapons as being effectively a suicide pact across the whole of civilization. I think it's a very dangerous situation to be in, and one that should not be entered into ever, really, because I'd rather be a live coward than a dead hero. But again, that's my self-preservation mechanism that's coming in. And the final cut uses this track as the last track to kind of explain these are the stakes. Not just you and me having a battle or two countries having a land war anymore. It's about possibly the whole fate of all mankind forever and making us all extinct in a nuclear winter. At this point, I should probably get a police warden's hat and a little face to come up and look like the Threads DVD and Blu-ray cover, but I won't because it's downstairs and I forgot to get it. But the final cut is a powerful, powerful concept album about conflict between human beings, set in the backdrop of the greatest interpersonal conflict that I think David and Roger and Nick ever really experienced. When this album was recorded, Roger quickly came to the opinion that he was never going to record with David and Nick ever again. And he didn't, because a month after he finished this album, we went into the same studio with everyone that recorded the final cut, apart from David and Nick, and recorded another album, a solo album called The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which is the subject of the next episode that I will be talking about in my chronological canter through the miserable works of Pink Floyd. And with that, I'm going to wrap up here and say thank you very much for watching this, which is definitely longer than the Final Cut album. I hope you enjoyed it more than the record, which, to be fair, isn't very difficult because the record is really bloody gloomy. And I will catch up with you in a future episodes. If you have any suggestions about what you'd like to hear me talk about, don't forget to put them in the comments. And if you have any questions, you can ask them as well. I can't guarantee I'll answer them. I'll give it a shot. In the meantime, there's not going to be another one of these this week, I think, because I've got a gig on Wednesday. I'm really looking forward to that. I'll tell you about that when I get back. And in the meantime, stay beautiful, beautiful ones. Take care of yourselves and each other. And I will see you soon. Okay. Bye-bye.